Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Scott Lyons, and I am your host of the Embodied Psychology Summit. And I am so excited to be here with Stephen Porges. So Dr. Stephen Porges is a distinguished university scientist at Indiana University, where he is the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium and the Kinsey Institute. He is professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for Psychophysiological Research and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is a former recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. Whew. That's a long title, Stephen. He is the originator of Polyvagal Theory, a theory that emphasizes the importance of psychological state in the expression of behavioral, mental, and health problems related to traumatic experiences. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to just continue this conversation with you. And I know so many people are excited for that as well. Feels like such an honor to hang out with you.
Well, thank you, Scott. I'm very flattered, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this summit.
My pleasure. So I think just starting out in a framework kind of way of just sharing sort of the foundational elements of polyvagal theory, and then we'll get into other questions.
Well, polyvagal theory is actually simpler than you may think because there's a real level of intuition. The first point is that our physiological state really impacts on how we react to the world. And so if we start off by acknowledging that the physiological state, whether we feel our body in terms of our heart pounding or we feel agitated, we're in a different state and we perceive the world differently, and we have a different repertoire of, let's use the term, adaptive reflexive behaviors. The part that's really unique about the theory is that it articulates the hierarchy within the body of how we regulate our states. And the unique part is that for mammals, the unique part is that mammals have a branch of the vagus, which is part of our parasympathetic nervous system, that during our evolution and during our own embryology started off as a different branch, and it migrated. Some of these fibers or neurons within the brainstem migrated to an area that regulates the muscles of the face and head. And this also becomes intuitive because now we understand that people's physiological state is being projected in their voice and in their facial expressivity. And we also, in understanding this, we realize that there are portals of calming our nervous system through the reciprocal facial expressivity, through listening to prosodic vocalizations that have a lot of intonation. And then we realize that when we're in that state, we're literally containing or constraining our defenses. So polyvagal theory says, in a sense, the goal of our civilization or our humanity is to keep our autonomic nervous system in a state that supports health, growth, and restoration, and not in a state that supports defensive behaviors. Polyvagal theory also emphasizes that we have two defense systems, not merely a fight-flight system, but a system of shutting down, which is extremely evolutionarily ancient. And in the world that many of the participants come from, they know that people, when they have trauma histories and have experienced this as a shutting down, a hopelessness or a loss, they often gravitate to behavioral strategies that keep them mobilized, because there's a hierarchy. As long as you stay mobilized, you can't shut down. So we implement that in the world we live in. This gets expressed as anxiety, addictions, workaholic behavior, people exercise addictions, where people say, I can't cope with feeling stillness. My body goes ballistic. So polyvagal theory really provides a language of how our nervous system either supports our ability to co-regulate with another or supports defense. And you start seeing this comorbidity, which is not a comorbidity. You see that if our autonomic nervous system is in a state of defense, we also have social and mental health issues.
Thank you for encapsulating years of research and development into 2 minutes. That's pretty impressive, actually. So, Stephen, how does that, I want to go back to when you talk about the defense mechanisms of fight or flight and sort of naming those particular ones. And how does the other research in terms of the expansion of other responses or adaptive responses fit into that?
Yeah, well, you use the important word, and that was adaptive responses, because in the society that we live in, when people are defensive, we think it's a voluntary behavior. So people whose bodies are in a state trying to protect them are now being evaluated and criticized for not having that behavior under control, whether they have autistic features or whether they have oppositional features. So we have all kinds of diagnostic categories without the appreciation that many of those behaviors are really the emergent properties of those physiological states. So if your physiology is in a state of primarily sympathetic activation, you don't have the capacity to co-regulate with another person, meaning reciprocal interactions. So we start seeing this impact of our physiological state on other. But the one thing we tend to forget is that we evolved to mitigate our defenses through social interaction. This is, in a sense, the way that the evolution of our species is through welcoming another into our world and trusting them. The complication occurs if there's a history of violation of trust. Then trusting becomes vulnerable and the body learns really well. And this goes actually to the work of a lot of my friends, Bessel van der Kolk. The body keeps score. The body doesn't want to forget this. And Peter Levine's work, the body gets encoded, but really it's not the body keeps the score. It's our nervous system keeps the score. And the information going into our nervous system is coming from two directions: higher brain structures where we have associations, and organs up through the vagal, but through the sensory pathways to the brainstem. So it's this bidirectionality, and we are handicapped by our conceptualization of a central nervous system and a peripheral or a body nervous system. We have one nervous system. It talks to each other, all the components. It's not an original idea. An individual got the Nobel Prize for documenting in 1949 that the brain controlled the visceral organs and the visceral organs controlled the brain. However, hasn't been, let's say, it didn't transition to inform medical community or even psychiatric community about this. Perhaps it was too difficult to see things as complex feedback loops. And for medicine, it was much easier to look at end organ processes or end organ damage. And the toolkit for measuring neural regulation of those end organs is extraordinarily limited and not a valid or let's say, a question that is really in the forefront in internal medicine and health.
So when you talk about this, I mean, that it's not just an original idea, but that it's actually been around for quite some time and hasn't yet been integrated. I'd like to follow up from that a little bit, because here we are with like a neuroscience theory that all of a sudden has become hugely impactful in the world of somatic therapy. Just to start off with, did that surprise you?
Well, yes, it surprised me because this was not my world. I had to be invited into the world of somatic therapies, but really invited into the world of trauma. And it was, in a sense, a gracious invitation. And it was a reinterpretation of my own work because I was providing what I thought were explanations of adaptive survival mechanisms. I hadn't even used in my own vocabulary the word dissociation. I never used it. I will tell you, I was invited to give a talk to the International Society of the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and the talk was a Pierre Genet honorary talk, and I had to look up to find out what he did, and he was the one who, of course, brought dissociation into trauma. And so I had to start investigating what that meant and seeing it from a polyvagal perspective as an adaptive survival mechanism. So the issue was to reframe the clinical symptoms into a systematic understanding of where the body goes and what comes out of the body being in those states. So the answer, really, the short answer was I was, let's say, shocked, might be a mild term. I was respectful because I was walking into other people's territories, but it also provided me with an opportunity to learn. And then you start understanding a little bit more about me. I would be invited to give talks at these trauma meetings, and I would go to the meetings and I would listen and I would learn. And over time, I think I have a real good understanding of the effects of trauma, even from a very deep clinical level of understanding what clients or individuals who have experienced it feel. At least that's what many of them say to me, that I'm able to give them a roadmap of their own experiences. And actually, Peter, one of the terms that Peter uses is he calls the theory a roadmap. And it provided him and the whole growth of somatic experiencing with a scientific basis of understanding what they were doing. Not what they were doing wasn't working, it was working. But now they have another vocabulary to explain the progression and the helpfulness of their model.
So in that way, it sounds like the somatic therapist really took a shining to your work because it offered a context and a map and a scientific validation of what they were seeing in process of session.
Yeah. Right, and they were, it says, looking for traction from the scientific world, and they were being given imaging studies. They were being given a disembodied approach to explain what they were going through, which was top down, and they all knew that the top down strategies didn't provide sufficient information to explain the phenomena that they were observing.
Yeah. So in your own work, would you have said it's been an evolution then in both top down and bottom up?
Well, yes, because I started as a psychophysiologist. And what I was doing was tasking individuals, psychological tasks, looking at autonomic changes, and basically with this goal of understanding what processes were going on by a peripheral manifestation. That left me when I started to really delve into mechanisms underlying heart rate variability, which was a neural component regulating the heart. So it wasn't merely the heart, it was the brain regulating the heart. And then you could start seeing the impact of changes in that system when different demands were coming up from the body, metabolic demands, threat demands, preparing the body to move, and then finally to see this manifestation of this ancient vagal circuit of shutting down and basically death feigning. And then you start seeing how that becomes adaptive. So that potentially is lethal. So what does the nervous system do with those cues after it has this initial shutting down? It basically shifts into a very unusual state, a state of dissociation. So the body doesn't shut down, but the mind goes someplace else. And you start seeing that as this, in a sense, a brilliant adaptation of enabling the individual to survive.
I love how you paint it as a process of adaptation.
Yeah, well, I am putting together, there's a new book, it's another edited book of more recent papers after the initial 2011 book. And it's really primarily papers over the last decade. And the book is put into 4 sections. And the first section is really foundational, almost, I should say, difficult to read papers. But the second section deals with the embodiment of these principles in different clinical treatments. So there are papers that I wrote with group psychotherapists. I wrote with other people who are using polyvagal theory in the modality that they're working in. The third section deals with my own work on autism and my own work on trauma. But in the front of the paper, in front of the book, is an introductory chapter. And it really starts talking about what I expected when I brought the theory out there. And I start to have a better understanding of where I was and what I thought was derivative. And this really is the issue. I thought polyvagal theory is so obvious. It's so derivative. I'm just in a sense fortunate to be there, let's say, first. And it was just so obvious to me. And I didn't realize it was, in a sense, a transformative model. It was paradigm shifting because I didn't see it, because I was not a good witness of the science that I was in. The science I was in was dealing with a linear model of arousal theory. That was it. You were too aroused, you're not aroused enough. It was the inverted U-shaped function that was the Yerkes-Dodson law that was identified in the early 1900s. It had no nuance of an underlying neurophysiology, but arousal fit nicely because arousal and sympathetic activity and arousal and EEG activation fit together as a continuity, and that was the world I was in. And so I thought I was now creating a derivative. It was now a nuanced one. And I didn't realize that there was, in a sense, a reason why it was new. And the reason was certain concepts could not be easily understood with the models that people had been trained under, meaning that they were very comfortable with linear models or linear additive models. They did very poorly with oscillations that represented feedback loops. They didn't do well with the concept of homeostasis. So they didn't have the indices to measure whether the end organs were being monitored and were functioning well. Instead, they focused on end organ disease or damage. So most people who go to physicians, they're doing these really remarkable assessments. It's not to, in a sense, say the assessments are useless, but they are useless in identifying the antecedents of end organ damage, which is neuroregulation changes, and now the nervous system is no longer supporting health growth and restoration of those organs. It's literally putting those organs at risk. And that's really where medicine and medical assessment needs to go. And that would be a polyvagal understanding, that we have these dynamic feedback loops between the end organs and the central nervous system. They're continuous. It's a continuity of a one nervous system model.
Yeah, that's something that's always stood out, is like the shift you offered through your work away from a binary paradigm and more into a holistic paradigm.
Well, you see, we use the word binary because we live in a world that says there's function or there's dysfunction. Yeah. And we never talk about that continuity or the continuous reactions, which can start off as transitory changes and then move into a chronic retuning. And we don't talk that way. And we live in a world like in mental health. For mental health to be, in a sense, a valid branch of medicine, it had to have a disease-oriented model. And so rather than thinking about underlying processes that support the manifestation of these diseases, we think in terms of there's a unique disease and it must have a genetic basis. It's never so what polyvagal theory says, wait a moment. Many of the things that you think are diseases might merely be state changes. And those state changes carry with them a set of emergent properties. So polyvagal theory carries with it this optimistic viewpoint that we can literally retune our nervous system to move it into more of a safe zone where we can then be more supportive of our homeostatic processes. And in doing that, we become better interactive co-regulators with others.
It gave me shivers. I so deeply appreciate moving it from a disease model of like this, there's something that's wrong with you to, hey, there's an emergent process that's happening.
Well, this is an interesting point because what I'm working on now is the development of a polyvagal informed navigator for medical practices.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal of that is to recruit the patient's nervous system as a collaborator in a journey of knowledge and health, as opposed to saying we're evaluating you. So all aspects of medicine are threat interactions, and the nervous system doesn't do well. We have terms like white coat, hypertension, the environment or the fear of going to a physician, because the physician is not there to encourage you to be in this joint journey of knowledge about yourself. So medicine needs to create a psychoeducational or a medical educational model of shared responsibility. And so in a way, the physician needs to calm us down and understand where we are, and then build a narrative, help us build a narrative of safety and health.
Thank you. I think that's so imperative that we look at the linguistics and we look at the behaviors and the structures of medicine. And I include even psychology and other realms of medicine. And the way that we are languaging, the way that we are behaving actually has a significant impact on those we're with.
Well, the trauma world is helpful in teaching us about that because people with trauma histories are really prone to be reactive because they're, use a term I use is neuroception. The neuroception is ramped to or biased to detect threat, even when there might not be threat. So they're telling you that if you use the wrong words, their body goes into defense. And the issue is how are we dealing with people who need appropriate diagnoses, appropriate assessments, so that we can work with them to be healthy, whether it's a medical or physical disorder or a mental disorder. And from my perspective, they're all the same. They disrupt the underlying neurophysiological state, but in medicine, it's termed comorbidities. But it's really the nervous system moving into a state of defense.
Great. Thank you for naming that. I want to go back for a moment to chapter 2 in your new book. And you describe chapter 2 as sort of how others have been applying your theory in practice.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear kind of what you've been learning from other people who are applying your theoretical and applied models.
Yeah, there's also a book of clinical applications that was edited with Deb Dana, and there are many chapters in that book with the same objective. And the objective was to be an enabler, not an empower, not this as giving them, this is yours. It's, this is yours. What can you make with it? So it was really, again, this becomes the privilege of being around for a long time and having, let's say, won the war and won the battles. There's not a need state in me for being people praising me. There's a need state in me for my ideas to be to transform clinical practice. So it is a gift to me when people take the ideas and they are creative with that. So with the second part of the title of that book with Deb Dana was the emergence of polyvagal informed therapies. And it was that polyvagal informed really says that the therapist, the clinician, does what they do, but they're informed by the polyvagal theory. Now, in our Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, we are doing a survey of trauma therapists. And and we want to know about their history, whether they have a trauma history, but we also want to know what were the practices that they felt were beneficial. Now, we learned out of the first 500 therapists that we've looked at the data on, is that we found out that the somatic therapies are the ones that the trauma therapists feel are the most beneficial. And this is in contrast to those that are more cognitively oriented. The other part that is really very important is that the other point that's important is that the most prevalent identified therapeutic modality was polyvagal informed, even though there's no therapy that's polyvagal. It was that they viewed it as being embedded in what they were doing. And the final point is that on average of that 500 trauma therapists, on average, the trauma therapist was trained in 8 different specialties, meaning somatic experiencing, internal family systems, CBT. They were trained in multiple, meaning that they were getting the toolkits that they thought would be helpful. And what the survey said is they're getting a vast array of tools and they're mixing and matching to be as helpful as possible to their clients. But they were very biased to the effectiveness of somatic therapies.
That's available in...
Well, this is what so there's one can send an email, actually if there are trauma therapists on board watching this, send an email to trauma@indiana.edu and ask to join the consortium, and then they can be part of the survey, and the newsletters will provide the information. There is a bias, though, that many of the people filling out the questionnaires are somatic therapists. So or at least but remember, most are not just somatic therapists. They may be somatic therapists with CBT. So CBT was very prevalently used, but it was not viewed as beneficial. Yeah. So it's a real interesting issue. They have toolkits and they are really trying it all out. But I would really invite anyone who is involved in the trauma community to join the consortium and fill out the survey, because the second stage of that is also being launched now, and that is the therapists are going to refer clients. So the goal was to get at least 1,000 therapists and 10,000 clients. So you really have now a document that enables the narrative of the trauma survivor to be accurately represented.
Wow, that's exciting.
We're learning. See, this is the part. What can we learn? Yeah. And can we ask the relevant questions that can be translated into practice? Can we provide therapists with greater intuitions about the clients that they're seeing by really getting a greater population of them, so we can find out more of the features?
Yeah, it's incredible. Thank you for doing that.
It's part of my journey and my mission, and my personal journey is to take the ideas that I thought were derivative and quite obvious, but to have them moved into practice so that medicine, and especially in mental health, and especially in the comorbidities of those who have survived trauma, are better understood, so they're not running to a GI specialist because they have irritable bowel syndrome or a neurologist because they have fibromyalgia, that they have a different understanding of what their body is doing, so they don't feel that they are crippled by their body, but they start developing a respect that their body is trying to take care of them. but they also now have to honor that and take care of their body.
There's a real option for empowerment there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a shared journey, and we need to get the support people, the medical staff, the mental health staff, to help be guides on this journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other part is most of the people who are survivors of trauma who have all these other ailments are shameful of those ailments. They feel that their body has failed them, and this leads to a disembodiment. And the goal of polyvagal theory is to create that, or a goal is to create that personal narrative that enables one to get back into their body, embodiment.
So how would you then define trauma?
Okay, the operational one that I have, it's not the event. You see, again, we're totally confused. And it's not that scales like ACEs isn't important, but we know that some people walk through fire and they are resilient. And we know that other people, just a smell of smoke, literally, sets them and they can't function. When we calibrate this by event, we exclude many individuals. We're disrespectful to the individual differences of the reactivity of the physiological response. So I say that, so the summary statement I make is polyvagal theory enables the human narrative to shift from a documentary of events to a documentary of feelings. It raises up our individual reactions and makes that the important event. And I also play with my let's say, I play with Descartes' statement, which is, je pense, donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. And I said, well, what would it be that if he said, je me sens, I feel myself, using the reflexive form of feel, therefore I am. If I feel myself, therefore I am. And that is the whole issue of embodiment. If I feel myself, I am. And we are not at the state where we are respectful of enabling individuals to feel themselves. We are not good witnessers in general. We are chronically evaluating others. And we have a vocabulary that is evaluative, and then we justify it. And as we are evaluative in our language and justify it, the person who we want to be helpful to gets further and further, becomes more and more numb, more and more disembodied. So even though our narrative of who we are is loving and kind, we are actually hurtful in many cases.
I love that. I feel, therefore I am. And, you know, I do feel like it's certainly part of the scope of this summit of asking the next question, which is what I'll ask you is, how do we feel? Not the mechanisms per se.
Well, let's go back even to the language. So I used the French. I didn't go into Latin for Descartes, went into the French, because in French, it's very easy to have the reflexive form of to feel, which is to feel myself. In English, we don't use that form. We don't have that form. And our language, therefore, is a language that is dissociated or disembodied. So the first part is the language that we use, because our body is responding to that language. It carries with a lot of attributes that we react to. So you want to know, how do we feel our body? I've thought a lot about this, and this is where I basically tap out and say I'm not a therapist, but let's assume that therapists are listening to me. And so one person who listened and elaborated on this is Deb Dana. And what Deb does is basically enables people to feel the different states through visualizations. There are other people who do it through breath. Dick Brown and Pat Gerbark, who are two psychiatrists who do breath work. It's amazing work. And through their breath work, they're moving people into these different states. And in moving and feeling those states, they not only enable the person to experience it, they are also giving a toolkit to the individuals of how to move in and out of it.